Hey everybody, in this video I'll be reviewing the Mortal Enemies supplement for the miniature skirmishing wargame Frostgrave. Mortal Enemies was released in March of 2024 and was written by Frostgrave creator Joseph A. McCullough and published by Osprey Games. Welcome to Bricks and Blocks Gaming. I'm Alan. Let's get to the bricks and blocks of the Mortal Enemies supplement for Frostgrave. There's two main focuses of this supplement. The first is rules for creating a reoccurring mortal enemy that shows up from time to time to cause trouble for a warband, and the second is an expansion on the wizard's bases, with rules for how to mount an assault, to loot an opponent's hideout, and how to defend your turf. In addition to this, the book contains 5 solo scenarios that can be used as filler battles or a whole campaign to battle with a mortal enemy. Or there's conversion rules for each scenario if players want to use them for standard competitive battles against each other. Like almost all Frostgrave supplements, there's a new treasure table with lots of new magical items to find. And there's a new thing for the game called base upgrades, which work differently than base resources, as they're things you can purchase or enchantments you can cast on your base to help defend it from an assault. There's no new soldiers in this supplement, but there are some new out-of-game spells players can use if their gaming group chooses, and there are some new monsters to deal with for the scenarios. The book starts, like many of Joe's books, with an introduction explaining the author's thought process and motivations for making the supplement, and these are always fun to read to learn more about his creative thoughts and see his continued passion for his game. After that, the book gets into how to create a mortal enemy for each and every player that's involved with the campaign, whether you're playing with multiple players or just playing solo. The mortal enemies are adversarial spellcasters that can have a grudge against each specific warband, or they can be used to create kind of a boss fight if players don't want to have them as an ongoing part of their campaign. The book has rules for when mortal enemies show up. It's somewhat randomized, and players can either integrate them into whatever scenario they're playing, or use one of the scenarios found later in this book that are specifically geared toward their rivals appearing. To create your mortal enemy, you'll be rolling on a series of tables, starting with one to determine the species of your opposing spellcaster. They're usually humans or humanoids, but they can be demons, constructs, undead, or a variety of other creatures. This table gives their stats and special abilities, and a threat level that affects the experience points gained for facing them and enhances their spells a little bit. Then, to make sure that no two mortal enemies are the same, you roll up stat modifications, similar to level increases. Then you roll up their spells. Each of the spellcasters get 2 ranged spells, which will be their main sources of offense used against the player. They have 2 utility spells used to buff or protect their team, and they get 1 out-of-game spell. All of the ranged and utility spells can be found in the main Frostgrave rulebook, but some of the out-of-game spells are new. One of these penalizes all rolls of 1 target soldier. One is similar to the Forget spell, which was found in the 1st edition book, but was removed for 2nd edition. One places a giant rat near an enemy's deployment zone. One potentially causes all of the opposing warband members to start with a point of damage. And one penalizes a soldier's will rolls for the entire game. While these spells aren't necessarily options for players to learn, the book does allow groups to house rule them as learnable. After rolling up their spells, the mortal enemies gain a random special ability, essentially adding a trait, a strength, or a defense to them, and they get to roll up 1 magical item. I initially assumed that the mortal enemies would start with a standard warband of 8 soldiers and possibly an apprentice, but this isn't the case. Instead, they roll on a table to figure out their gang. This is a group of possibly soldiers or possibly creatures. Most of these gangs will include 5 figures, though some might have an additional construct or animal. The reason these groups are smaller is because they aren't designed to be the full threat of the scenarios they're in. Rather, they're like a side quest or unexpected hazard that show up while the player or players are trying to accomplish the main task of whatever scenario they're playing. So they're more like massive random encounters that show up. And the players are encouraged to add some character to their adversary by giving them a name, a backstory on who they are or their motivations for tracking down and battling the player, and this just adds some narrative to the story that unfolds during a Frostgrave campaign. At this point, the mortal enemies are given an ambush number, which is different than the threat number they got earlier, and this is used at the start of each game to determine whether or not the enemy will show up at some point during the battle. Each game they don't show up, the ambush number is modified to make them more likely to appear in the next game, and when they do show up, the number is reset back to their starting number, so it'll be unlikely to encounter them again for a while. And the book states that on average, mortal enemies should be showing up about every 5 to 7 games. Once it's determined that the enemy will show up during the battle, there's a number of tables to roll on to figure out which turn they show up, as well as where they'll deploy and their current motivation or target for this specific battle. And there's also special rules for how to control the mortal enemy and their gang, which are different than standard uncontrolled creatures. And these changes help them focus on their motivation and add an extra layer of danger for the players. After battling a mortal enemy, the wizard gains experience points for fighting them. Any gang members that are reduced to 0 health are replaced for free. However, if the mortal enemy themselves is defeated, they roll on a special survival table. And if they end up dead, the book has ways to create a new mortal enemy. But assuming they live through any survival rolls, these adversaries will grow in strength, essentially leveling up. They roll on tables to increase their stats, add members to their gang, learn new out-of-game spells, and gain magical equipment. As mentioned earlier, there are 5 new scenarios, each specifically designed to serve as battlefields to face off against a mortal enemy. As such, they're designed for solo play, but can be converted for competitive play as well. It's suggested to use these scenarios in one of 2 ways. They can kind of serve as side quests. Perhaps you're in the middle of a solo campaign and you roll to face your mortal enemy. Then you can face them in one of these scenarios so they don't mess with the usual solo scenarios, which are usually pretty tough already. Or they can be used as catch-up battles during a regular competitive campaign. So if one player is behind on levels or had some awful survival rolls, they can play one of these scenarios against their mortal enemy, which tend to be less deadly than a battle against another player's warband. Most of the scenarios have simple terrain requests like pillars, small bridges or walkways, or small markers of some sort. So there isn't too much terrain crafting needed. Though one of the battles does call for a floating island surrounded by a deep crevasse, which will likely require some elevated terrain, unless the player just wants to use something to mark out the lines where the island and crevasse are on a 2-dimensional flat board. Most of these scenarios don't feature many monsters, as the main adversaries for these battles should be the player's mortal enemies. However, if you want to play all 5 scenarios, you'll need a Praklacore, which is kind of like a manticore, about 6 to 8 corpse wranglers, basically zombies with snakes coming out of their eyes, about 8 large elemental bats, about 7 to 10 murder jacks, which are giant crows with the wingspan about the height of a man, a juggernaut, a large metal-wheeled construct, and 4 old-fashioned ice spiders. The next part of the book explains how to set up and play base assaults. The rules for these battles assume player versus player confrontations, but it does give options for how to face off against a mortal enemy for a solo battle. To play a base assault battle, the players set up their table by constructing the base of the wizard who is being attacked, with both an interior and an exterior, but it's set up on a smaller 2.5 foot by 2.5 foot table. The base is placed in the middle of the table. The base is placed in the middle of the table, and it'll consist of 3 or 4 rooms connected together by doorways and connected to the outside by a few exterior doors. Next, the assaulting player picks items out of the defender's vault to serve as the treasure tokens the warbands are trying to either steal or protect, meaning the defender needs some spare magical items the attacker would actually want. And I would assume that grimoires would be the most likely items to be sitting around that aren't equipped on any figures. To give the defender some motivation for these battles, whenever an attacking figure falls in combat, any magical items they're carrying can be potentially looted by the defending figures. Setting up the warbands in this scenario is quite unique, because it's assumed this is a surprise attack. So only half the defender's warband starts on the table, while the rest will show up at the end of a random turn. And the attackers get to deploy their whole warband, but they can be spread out anywhere around the border of the table. And if playing this solo against a mortal enemy that's attacking the base, they gain some additional figures to join their assault. Another cool thing about assault battles is players can purchase upgrades for their base to help them defend their turf, including temporary constructs to do guard duty, explosive ruins to set up traps, reinforced doors to slow down attackers, reinforced walls that can't be destroyed by crumble, which is a spell that could really become useful in a battle like this, a control shaker, which prevents and cancels control spells in the area, a permanent draining word to affect your opponent's spellcasting, a protective shield to improve a warband's armor, a teleport escape hatch to use as an emergency exit, and an aura of true sight to spot invisible attackers. The defender also starts with 2 special wizard eyes to set up like security cameras that both wizard and apprentice can use, and more of these can be purchased. Something great about these upgrades is since most of them mimic existing spells, if you know the corresponding spells, you can use them out of game to lower the cost to purchase the defense systems. Lastly in the book, there's a new treasure table. And like most of the Frostgrave supplements, after any scenario, not just those from the Mortal Enemies book, players can swap out a roll for a normal treasure token for a roll on this table instead. Overall, I think this is an interesting supplement. The base assaults are an option that I think could be fun for any playgroup as either a one-off scenario or using the rules to make them randomly happen. However, since the treasure tokens require decent items to be held in a vault, I'm worried these battles wouldn't have much tension until later in a campaign. And even then they still might not, because the defender is just defending some stuff they obviously don't care enough about to use. Some house rules you could use to remedy this would be to allow treasures to be made up of equipment the warband is using. Like they set their stuff down to do something else, and now the items can be grabbed. And to raise the threat for the attacker, their fallen team members could be held for ransom if they fall inside the walls of the base. Another suggestion, if there's no major gain for either warband, is to just have regular treasure tokens. Like the home team recently found some stuff laying around the ruins that they just haven't had a chance to sort through yet. For the mortal enemies, I'm glad they're not just a regular warband with a 8-spelled wizard, apprentice, and 8 soldiers. Something about this difference just makes them feel more like a boss from a video game or something you'd face in a dungeon-crawling board game. I personally think mortal enemies fit best in solo play, either as a recurring enemy or as the main focus of a mini-campaign playing through the 5 scenarios in this book. As one potential drawback with using these adversaries in competitive campaigns is they have the potential to greatly lengthen a play session, because 5 to 7 figures showing up on the board creates a lot more pieces to move and many more tactical decisions to make. So for players with limited game time, adding mortal enemies might not be the best choice, as you might not have time to finish your battles. But overall, it's a great supplement with lots of neat ideas. It's fun to read, and purchasing it supports Frostgrave and the author, allowing him to create more great content for this game. And checking out these videos, subscribing, liking, and commenting supports this channel. I want to thank you for watching. I'm Alan with Bricks and Blocks Gaming. Play well.